Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each episode of this podcast alternates between an interview with a guest or multiple guests and a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship. In this particular episode, I'm unpacking the chapter titled Applications of Affinity Space Characteristics in Music Education by Jared O'Leary. Apologies that I mispronounced your name. Just kidding, that's me. Alright, so this is a chapter that came out last year, and I'm going to talk about how it relates to computer science education. Alright, so here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, affinity spaces are the physical, virtual, or combination of locations where people come together around a shared affinity. Interest. Affinity spaces can act as a participatory hub for music making and learning through social networking and sharing. Although music affinity spaces exist in myriad informal spaces, little scholarship explores potential applications of affinity space characteristics within formalized learning spaces. This chapter introduces characteristics of an affinity space and questions the role of the framework in relation to another framework commonly used in online music learning communities of practice. This chapter concludes with a discussion on practical and theoretical applications of affinity space characteristics within formalized educational contexts. End quote. All right, so even though I wrote this particular chapter for the Oxford Handbook of Social Media and Music Learning, I'm going to talk about this in relation to computer science education, because this, after all, is a CS podcast. Now, if you find this particular discussion interesting, I just want to let you know that there are many more resources on my website and in the show notes that relate to this particular chapter. So make sure you click on the link in the show notes and take a look at some of the questions that are on the show notes page, or even look at some of the other presentations and publications I've done. And by the way, if the idea of interest-driven learning interests you and you are a researcher and want to collaborate, please reach out to me and let me know. There's a contact me button on my website. Always willing to chat. Okay, so some background. Affinity spaces was coined by James Paul Gee, who's a professor that I had at ASU, and he said it was basically like a reaction to some of the shortcomings that he perceived in communities of practice. So he was analyzing some informal learning spaces, such as like discussion forums and like online learning spaces and whatnot, where people are able to come together and share their passions and their interest in a very specific topic. And so he came up with these characteristics after looking at a bunch of different spaces, and then basically theorize, here are some potential things that we can learn in education context, like formalized educational context. However, most of his writing was very theoretical. It was like, here's hypothetically how you could do this thing. So after I read a bunch of his scholarship on this, I really wanted to go back into the classroom and try and figure out, well, what would this actually look like? So when I went back into the classroom and was teaching K-8 coding and makerspace classes, I applied each of these characteristics into the classes that I was working with. So this chapter is basically a summary of what the characteristics are and how I applied them in my classroom, and then I translate it into music education context. But for your own background, all of these characteristics were actually applied in coding and makerspace classes originally when I was actually doing them in the classroom. But because the audience for this particular book was music educators, I wrote it for music educators. So I'm going to translate it back to the original context for you. All right, so affinity spaces have been discussed in a variety of different communities, such as people who are interested in the game Dance Dance Revolution, or the video game The Sims, or Neopets writing communities, or even affinity spaces around specific celebrities, or other just like video games and video game mods, or even the chip scene, which is what I actually looked at for my dissertation. So the scholarship was basically looking at like informal learning spaces where people are not required to attend, but choose to come together and share their interest in a very specific topic. So think of like a subreddit. That could be a form of an affinity space. All right, so here's a summary of the 12 characteristics. This is from page 66. Number 1, affinity spaces share a common endeavor. Number 2, affinity spaces are not segregated by age. Number 3, affinity spaces are not segregated by experience. Number 4, affinity spaces encourage but do not require active participation. Number 5, interaction transforms content within an affinity space. Number 6, affinity spaces encourage both intensive and extensive knowledge. Number 7, affinity spaces encourage individual and distributed knowledge. Number 8, affinity spaces encourage dispersed knowledge. Number 9, affinity spaces encourage and honor tacit knowledge. Number 10, affinity spaces encourage a multitude of engagement. Number 11, affinity spaces have multiple routes to status. And number 12, leadership is porous and leaders are resources. All right, so in the chapter itself, I summarize each of the characteristics, and then I go into a brief example of what this looks like in informal spaces. So I'm going to talk about that now in relation to CS education. All right, so characteristic 1, affinity spaces share a common endeavor. So in a computer science class, this might be a common endeavor around wanting to create things with code. Although there might be a variety of reasons why somebody is participating in a space that is dedicated to learning about computer science or programming, the subject itself could be the shared common endeavor. However, that depends on how you frame the class. So if you assume buy-in from students, then like it's an elective class or something like that, then you might be able to have the common endeavor around coding or programming. However, if it is a mandatory class, you can't assume that there is a shared common endeavor because students are required to be there, like in the K-8 classes that I was working with. So what I tried to do was make it so that while they shared a common experience, they were able to explore that through their own specific interests and then work together or individually and get feedback from other individuals in the class or outside of the class, talk about later, to explore their interests through code. So it became a medium for expression. All right, so characteristic 2, affinity spaces are not segregated by age. So within an affinity space, like an informal learning space, you might have some adults in there, you might have some teenagers in there, a wide range of ages and whatnot within the space sharing their experiences. So for example, if you go to a space like Stack Overflow, people who respond might be in their 50s, or they might be a teenager. And your age does not determine whether or not you get elevated in status. It's your level of contribution and quality of contribution that determines whether or not people engage with the content that you're sharing. So for example, if you write a really awesome line of code, people might promote it, and it's not segregated into, okay, well, only the younger programmers are in this space and the older programmers are in a separate, disconnected space. So this is different how we typically see things in schools. Unless you're in some kind of like a mixed grade level, like a Montessori style class or some other kind of class that just has combined grade levels, you're likely going to have kids who have like a 1 or 2 year age difference in the classes that you're in. And that's about it. So one way that I actually applied this characteristic in the coding classes is I would, one, have an elective where kids could attend. So that made it at least so that 6th, 7th, and 8th graders could all share the same space. However, they didn't have elective options for the K through 5 classes. So what I did was make it so that on our class website, kids were able to share their projects, whether it was in a Scratch studio or in a folder, and they were able to look at and engage with projects and code created by people in different grade levels, different ages. All right, so characteristic 3, affinity spaces are not segregated by experience. So experts through beginners are all able to share the same space. It's not segregated to, okay, all the beginners, you're in this particular space, all the intermediate individuals, you're in another space, and then all the experts, you're in a completely different, disconnected space. This is different than typically what goes on in K-12 context. So if we think of like math classes, we have it separated into, okay, you're going to learn this specific type of math for your particular level. And it really doesn't matter what grade you're in. What matters is your level of experience or expertise in math, which, by the way, that makes it easier for you to teach because you have a less dispersed set of expertise when working with those kinds of kids. However, it also makes it so that kids don't get to work with other kids who have different experience levels than them, which can be really rewarding, especially if you think of like the peer learning and whatnot that can occur if you have more experienced kids who are mentoring less experienced kids. So this is one of the things that I would try and do in the coding classes. So if somebody had a question and I knew that somebody else had the answer to that because they had more experience or deeper understanding of the problem that the other student was trying to solve, I'd pair them up and be like, hey, this person has a question. Can you help them out with that? So while it can sometimes be beneficial to pair students into groups and be like, okay, the novice programmers are going to be in this group, the intermediate and the advanced are going to be in 2 separate groups. If you were to explore this characteristic, you might be able to try and figure out how could I make it so that the students with different expertise is able to work with each other. All right, so characteristic 4, affinity spaces encourage but do not require active participation. Okay, so this one might be a little bit weird for you to think through in a formalized educational context where you're likely giving some kind of a grade. All right, so here's a quote from page 68 and 69. Quote, while members encourage others to participate within this space, how and when a member participates is up to them. These forms of participation may spread across a continuum of implicit and explicit participation, where people can lurk, interact with, respond to, or create new content. Unquote. All right, so think of like a subreddit forum, maybe one related to programming or something. You don't have to participate to actually view the content. You could see months or years worth of conversations going on without ever even responding, upvoting, or anything, in that particular space. Okay, so the way that I try to apply this in the classes that I work with is, let's say that there were a couple of kids who wanted to work on a game together, and one of them was being the driver, the other person was being the navigator. The navigator never necessarily had to switch spots with the driver, which is typically done in paired programming. Like, set a timer for 20 minutes, and then every 20 minutes you switch who is the driver and who is the navigator. Okay, common practice. Works pretty well in some instances, but in my classes, I didn't require that. What I did want to see is that people actually understood what was occurring. So if somebody wanted to be the navigator only, so they would just kind of engage in dialogue with their partner or partners, I wanted them to at least understand what the person with the mouse was actually doing and could explain what was going on in the code. I didn't want them to just sit there and not know what was going on. However, they did not actually have to write any lines of code. Most students, probably at least 90 to 95% of kids, wanted to actively participate because they wanted to express themselves and create something interesting to them. But there was maybe one student every other class or so who wanted to work in these kind of scenarios where they just wanted to learn working with somebody else, but they didn't necessarily want to be the person who created it. They'd engage in the dialogue, but not necessarily actively create anything. And my administration was completely okay with this because they were at least engaged and they understood what was going on. I could still assess their understanding, and they did well. It's just their form of participation differed from their peers, which for me was fine. All right, so characteristic 5, interaction transforms content within an affinity space. All right, so here's a quote from page 69. Quote, as priorities shift among affinity space members, the visibility and organization of content within the space repositions in relation to changes in priorities. For example, priority topics within a forum tend to appear at the top of the forum for ease of access. In addition, content within affinity spaces continuously change due to the interactions within a space. End quote. All right, so in a classroom, what I tried to do was make it so that when kids submitted their projects and they wanted to share it on the class website, that would change what was available for the other classes to take a look at. So the submission of a project to be placed on the class website and within studios and things like that transform the content by making it so that other students could now engage with that content and remix it, alter it, comment on it, etc. This led to some really interesting types of engagement where a kid would come up with a unique idea, like, I want to create a quiz game about my favorite candy bars or something like that. When they'd submit that project and turn it in onto the studio, what I'd find over the next couple of weeks is several more kids would look at that project and go, oh, I really like that, but I'm going to do my own variation on it. I'm going to do my favorite celebrities or a quiz on my favorite rock bands or something like that. And then they would eventually submit their projects, and then that would transform the content, and that would inspire new variations on those projects. All right, so characteristic 6, affinity spaces encourage both intensive and extensive knowledge. Okay, so intensive knowledge is like the specialist knowledge or the depth, and the extensive knowledge is more of the expansive knowledge or the breadth of something. So within an affinity space, it encourages both. They want people to understand the affinity as a whole, the broader knowledge around the space, but they also value and respect individualized expertise within that space. So not everybody within the space is expected to know the same thing or be an expert on the same thing, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the next characteristic. So what this might look like in like my coding classes is I encourage kids to understand the range of things that could be created through code and the range of languages that they had options to use. So for context in my class, they could work on something in Scratch, or they could use JavaScript in Khan Academy or Ruby in Sonic Pi to code live music, or they could also use Swift and create something like an app in Xcode. So they had many different routes and options and things. And so I wanted them to understand what those different options were so they could choose a platform or language that best suited their particular interests. However, I wanted them to have intensive, in-depth knowledge on a very specific thing they wanted to do. So if they wanted to be a storyteller through Scratch, then great. I want you to be really good at storytelling. I don't want you to just keep repeating the same things in each one of your projects. I want you to keep diving deeper so that every project that you are building builds off of what you previously understood, but also dives deeper into areas that you don't understand. What typically happens in the K-12 space is we tend to focus on one or the other. Like we're all going to have intensive knowledge on one specific thing, or we're all going to have a survey breadth of knowledge understanding on a wide range of topics. If you think of the CS or coding curricula that you are using, I encourage you to think through in what ways is it encouraging extensive knowledge, in what ways is it encouraging intensive knowledge, and how could you potentially do both? All right, so characteristic 7, affinity spaces encourage individual and distributed knowledge. So because everybody has their own intensive knowledge or their own depth of understanding in areas of expertise that is interesting to them, this encourages individuals to have their own specialized knowledge. All right, so now where knowledge is distributed is, for example, in the coding classes that I worked with, some kids would really want to get good at player controls and make a variety of games with different player controls and whatnot. So if another student had a question about it, I would say, oh, well, this person over here has that individualized knowledge that you are looking for. So how about you chat with them and ask some questions and work with them to learn more about player controls. So because everybody had their own intensive and individualized knowledge, it made it so that the expertise was distributed, and it encouraged kids to go towards other experts within the shared space to learn more from them. All right, so characteristic number 8, affinity spaces encourage dispersed knowledge. So in addition to the distributed knowledge within the shared space, members also encourage sharing resources outside of the space. So what does that look like in a K-12 classroom? So for me, it was all about pointing to resources that might be able to help kids, whether it was like a tutorial or a video or something like that, or walking through showing kids, here's what I would do in order to try and solve that particular problem. So for example, maybe I would go in these Scratch discussion forums and see if somebody else has had a similar problem, or maybe go on the Scratch Wikipedia page to learn more about a specific thing to see if that might be able to assist me. And so I would help kids to understand that they're not just limited to my understanding of programming and helping them out, and that they are also not limited to the understanding of their peers in the classroom, in the shared physical space, but they can learn how to solve problems by getting resources outside of the space itself. Now, why is this important? Because for me, I was all about trying to get kids to understand that this is a lifelong process, and I'm not going to be there every single step of the way to answer their particular problems, and they're not going to have peers who are going to be able to answer their problems. So I wanted them to learn how to learn independently, so that way they could continue to learn about things they're interested in their own leisure time. All right, characteristic 9, affinity spaces encourage and honor tacit knowledge. All right, so this characteristic is another one that's a bit different than what's typically occurring within K-12 contexts. So here's a quote from page 71. Quote, in video game affinity spaces, members share knowledge not only through words, games related to the affinity space. People within these spaces often judge others by what they can do with knowledge and not what they can list. Application of knowledge is often valued higher than the knowledge itself. However, those interested in simply playing are not required to demonstrate their prowess to others. End quote. All right, so this is very different than what typically occurs in evaluations or assessments. So we want kids to be able to explain what they know, not just demonstrate that they can do something. So for example, some CS educators might look at a project and go, okay, that's an excellent project that you've created. The code works really well. However, I want you to add in comments that explains each one of these sections or each one of the functions in here so I can make sure that you understand what's going on. And that's great for assessing things. However, if you were to use this characteristic of the affinity space, you might just encourage, okay, I just want you to create things that are interesting to you. You don't need to explain to me how every little thing works. That might encourage happy accidents or experimentation. However, you could certainly pair those with some ipsative questions to encourage kids to reflect on something that they learned and how it compares with what they previously learned. Maybe even set goals for okay, now here's what I want to learn next, or here's what I want to create next, without necessarily being able to explain what they are creating. Now, by the way, I know some of these characteristics might be controversial, but I do encourage reading the chapter. I know I'm biased because I wrote it, but I hope this podcast episode kind of serves as a catalyst for questioning some of those thoughts that you might be having while listening to this, where you're going, yeah, Jared, but I really disagree with you right here. Okay, but why? What in your background led you to think that we should not honor tacit knowledge? And I say that because these are questions that I really grappled with when I was reading through James Paul G's discussions on affinity spaces. Okay, tangent over. So characteristic 10, affinity spaces encourage a multitude of engagement. Now, this type of engagement is both implicit and explicit forms of participation. So an explicit form of participation might be responding to somebody else's project or remixing somebody else's project. Whereas an implicit form of participation might be just to try out their project, to play it. If it's a game, maybe you'll just play their game. You might not comment on it. You might read through their code, but that's it. That would be a form of implicit engagement. Now, while most affinity spaces do encourage explicit forms of engagement over the implicit ones, there is not like a set minimum criteria. So an example of how this might differ from like a typical class that you might see is like, especially in online spaces, you might see like, create one original post and respond to 2 or 3 of your peers. Like that are examples of explicit and required forms of participation. But instead, for an assignment, you might just say to respond in some way to a specific topic, whether that's creating a post, responding to somebody else's post, sharing a resource, upvoting things, watching videos on a topic, or whatever. These are all different forms of engagement, and you can encourage different forms of engagement, which, by the way, aligns with some of the things that I talked about in a previous episode on the Universal Design for Learning framework. If you haven't listened to that episode, I'd recommend checking it out. Now, to be more explicit with this and to tie it more into like programming, you might say that instead of everybody doing the same kind of coding, like starting from a blank page, you could say, all right, if you'd like to, you can remix this particular project. Or if you'd like to, you could create your own project with your own ideas. Or if you'd like to, you could try and refine somebody else's code, so improve it in some way. Or you could try and reverse engineer somebody else's project by only looking at how it works, but not actually looking at the code. These are all different forms of engagement that all involve programming in some way. All right, so characteristic number 11, affinity spaces have multiple routes to status. So people in an affinity space can post things, they can respond to things, they can like, favorite, or thumbs up, thumbs down things, or rate something. They can share it in other areas or other spaces. These are all like forms of clout or status that can be gained within this space through the different types of engagement that can be done. Now, typically in a classroom setting, we might be limited to just a grade of assignments that are only seen by a teacher. And the only person who sees that grade is the student who submitted that assignment. That might be one route to status. However, if you were to use this characteristic, you might also say, okay, people can share their projects publicly if they choose to do so. And then students can respond to that by commenting on it or hearting it or favoriting it or whatever. Or we could have some art walk style showcasing where like you have your computer lab set up where everybody's standing around the computer and has their projects up. You can have community members come in and ask questions about their project and talk with students about what they created. This is another route to status that could be done, etc. So there are many different ways that students could potentially gain some clout or contribute their expertise in some way within the space itself. That can be intrinsically or extrinsically rewarding for the student. All right, so characteristic 12, leadership is porous and leaders are resources. So here's a quote from page 72. Quote, leadership in an affinity space is often porous, lacks overt power, and is reciprocal. Sometimes a person leads and other times a person follows. End quote. Now, G notes that leaders within these spaces often design the space and encourage participation, but they kind of can switch between like an audience and a peer or a leader, things like that. It's not a fixed designation where they are always leading. Now, the way that I applied this in the class is with how I facilitated it. So I was not always like leading a lecture or something like that. In fact, I basically never did that with a full group. I was a resource, and then I was able to respond to a student's question with some more questions that help guide them through their thinking. And I'll include some links to some podcasts that I've done on how I did that and some questions that you might consider in your class. They're going to be in the show notes. But I was also a connector. So whenever a student would come to me and ask a question, I would encourage them to connect with another peer who I knew could answer their question. So again, going back to the characteristic about individualized and distributed knowledge. I also would share whenever I was learning something or whenever I failed at something. So I'd like start the class and just like spend a minute and say like, hey, here's a project that I was working on this week, and here's a bug that I had, and here's how I solved it. Trying to show that I am also a learner. I'm not just the person who knows all of the answers to everything related to programming. And to let students know that, yeah, we all make mistakes in our code, and we all can learn from them. And here are some of the strategies I use to learn from my mistakes. All right, so the next section of this chapter is titled Using Affinity Spaces as a Lens for chipmusic.org. Now that is the discussion forum that I investigated for my dissertation. So if you're interested in that, you can read the dissertation itself, or you can just see this particular like couple pages to see, okay, well, how do each of these characteristics kind of work together within a space that is around people's shared interest in a topic. Now note that not every single affinity space needs to have all 12 of these characteristics. So if you're listening to this and you're like, okay, I really like, I don't know, characteristics 1, 2, and 3, but I don't know about characteristic 4. I don't know if I can do that in my classroom. Totally fine. So hopefully you listened to that previous section that I was just talking about, going, yeah, I might try that out, or, I don't know about that one. I need to think through that some more. You don't have to do all 12 of them. And in fact, you could just start with baby steps and just do one at a time and see how that works for you. Now, the section after that in this particular chapter is titled Juxtaposing Affinity Spaces with Communities of Practice. So Communities of Practice is a framework that was developed by Levin Wenger, and it talks about an apprenticeship model. And while G was heavily informed by Levin Wenger, affinity spaces in response to communities of practice, because G did not feel that it worked really well within like these informal online spaces in particular. So if you're interested in hearing more about how those two are similar and different, take a look at that section in the chapter. All right, so the next section is titled Affinity Spaces and Formalized Education. Now, I do note in here that it is difficult, if not possible, to force affinity space characteristics within a formalized educational context. You can certainly try, and you can do a lot of really awesome things, but you can't force upon students the idea of affinity spaces. All right, so here's a quote from page 76 that talks about how formalized educational contexts are different than affinity spaces. So this is a full paragraph I'm going to read for you. Quote, unlike affinity spaces, many formalized educational contexts require students to participate in classes regardless of shared interests. For example, graduation requirements mandating particular classes. Classes often segregate students by age or experience level, and often do not include discussion or collaborations with peers outside of the class, grade, or experience level. Some classes require active participation through a narrow scope of engagement. For example, some music classes focus on recreating the music of others rather than creating new music. However, when educators do encourage diverse modes of engagement, it is often through predetermined curricula or standards that seldom transform through student interaction. Rather than cultivating individualized expertise through collaboration with other experts in a shared domain, many educators, curricula, and standards attempt to ensure all students learn the same, extensive knowledge of a subject area. Getting help from peers within or outside of a class is often viewed as cheating, as schools tend to isolate students within a collective, or prevent access to outside resources. In some schools, doing is often less valued than saying. For example, music theory classes might favor music analysis over music performance or composition. Although schools tend to provide multiple routes to socially recognize success or status, GPA, club membership, athletics, honor roll, etc., classrooms often limit success to grades obtained through restricted criteria. Lastly, leadership within school is often one-sided. Students are learners and rarely teachers, and feedback comes from the teacher who is not a peer, end quote. Now, throughout that paragraph, I include the characteristic numbers, so that way you can reference like, oh, this is characteristic 4 that I was talking about right there. So while that may sound like a bummer, the next section of the chapter talks about an example of how to apply the affinity space characteristics in a classroom. All right, so I'm actually going to read this section entirely. So this is from page 76 to page 78. So this example that I'm about to read is talking about the Makerspace elective that I facilitated. However, every single one of these applied to the coding classes that I facilitated as well. Quote, imagine walking into a computer lab at a local K-8 school with computers lining the perimeter of the 2 longest walls and 2 rows of computers and tables facing inward in the center of the room. The room's design encourages social interaction for peer-to-peer sharing and learning, a daily process for all classes held in the space. When walking in, you immediately hear a lot of talking, laughing, and a jumble of music and sounds. Dozens of kids sit and work on a variety of projects at computers, tables, and on the floor. Others walk around the room examining others' projects, and some stand and discuss a variety of subject areas and interest relevant to media arts and technology. The theme of media arts and technology guides the kinds of projects we create in this class and acts as a shared common endeavor for those who sign up. Characteristic 1. Projects include creating music in GarageBand, coding art and animation with JavaScript, filming and editing stop-motion movies, coding games and stories with Scratch, designing web pages using HTML, coding music with Sonic Pi, drawing and animating pixel art, creating apps for the class set of tablets, building and listening to modular synthesizers using through Littlebits, taking apart and rebuilding old electronics, and more. Characteristic 10. Although district mandates require that students receive a grade for their elective, I base the grade on engagement in processes rather than creation of products. Characteristic 11. This includes passive engagement, where students provide feedback for peers but do not create their own products. Characteristic 4. For example, some students preferred to rotate around the room and provide feedback on other projects rather than creating their own. Within a class or two of examining and commenting on projects, these students often asked to collaborate with a peer whose project they found interesting, or they began working on their own creations inspired by their peers. In addition, I encourage tacit knowledge within creative processes and do not require an assessment or mandated demonstration of verbal or written understanding. Characteristic 9. The goal of the class is to acquire an extensive knowledge of the various happenings in the space, but also to encourage individuals to develop intensive knowledge useful for their own projects of interest. Characteristic 6. Students within the space choose when to turn in a project. However, there are no requirements for submitting projects, nor do they have to complete a project once started. This approach encourages a range of engagement, from weekly sampling to extended engagement with a project over multiple years. Characteristic 10. When someone creates a project they would like to turn in, they may choose to make their project publicly accessible, so others within and outside of our school may remix shared project files or engage with finalized products. This approach transforms not only the content within our class, but also within other classes across the school and beyond. Characteristic 5. For example, a student who creates music in Sonic Pi can choose to upload a text file of their creation into a folder that is accessible to other students in the school. This allows students the opportunity to download and remix the music in their coding classes, mandated for all grades K through 8, or by accessing the files on a personal computer outside of school. When members need more space or people for a particular project, we alter the room's arrangement or move into adjacent spaces. Characteristic 5. For example, we use the adjacent library when students decided to create a short film with several students in the class and a school administrator as actress and actor. Although this elective builds mixed ages and experience levels, characteristics 2 and 3, knowledge is dispersed, characteristic 8, across all grade levels and outside the school. Someone in second grade can interact with, comment on, or remix projects created by someone in another class, another grade, myself, or someone outside of our school. Characteristic 8. When someone has a question in the class, the expectation is to ask at least 2 classmates before asking me for help. However, when someone asks me a question, I often pair them with a peer who has expertise relevant to their question. Characteristic 7. Although I am a hired educator for this space, I deliberately position myself as a co-learner and encourage autonomy. Characteristic 12. I view my role as the initial designer of the space and facilitator of learning, but encourage the kids I work with to customize the space to match their own interests. Characteristic 5. During each class, I walk around asking questions about processes and products and encourage peer-to-peer learning and sharing. End quote. All right, so that was that particular section. Now, immediately following this, I provide a heuristic for this. So the next section is titled Affinity Spaces as a Heuristic, which provides some more explicit examples of some things to consider or think through if you want to try and apply some of these characteristics within your classroom. Now, I'm going to leave that as a teaser because I want to actually encourage you to read the chapter itself. However, I do want to state that normally I end these episodes with like some lingering questions or thoughts, but because I'm the person who actually wrote this thing, I know what I was thinking and don't really have questions for myself, but want to share some questions that I created for you. So in these show notes, I actually have some questions that I had included in the appendice for this particular chapter. However, I rewrote them all to specifically talk about computer science education. So for every single one of the 12 characteristics, there are between 3 and 8 questions to help you consider that particular characteristic in relation to a computer science space. So for example, for number 4, affinity spaces encourage but do not require active participation, here are some of the questions that I have under there. What kinds of CS engagement count as participation within a CS or coding class or community? What kinds of participation are required for members of a community or for a grade in a class? Who can or cannot participate in a space with prerequisite forms of engagement? How diverse are the forms of participation over time in a CS or coding class or community? What are the affordances and constraints of homogeneous participation within a shared space? What should educators or facilitators consider when designing educational spaces with a multitude of engagement? How might social media augment engagement in such spaces? So that style of questions and thinking is all applied to each one of the characteristics, and again is found in the show notes, which is linked to in the app that you're listening to this on, or you can simply go to jaredoleary.com and then clicking on the podcast tab. Now, by the way, if you are interested in these affinity spaces, make sure to check out the other presentations and publications, and even the 100% free curriculum that I develop for Boot Up Professional Development, which was heavily informed by the affinity space characteristics, and then also the rhizomatic learning that was discussed by Catherine Bornhorst, John Stapleton, and Katie Henry in a previous podcast episode that I will link to in the show notes in case you haven't heard that. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this particular episode. I've been intentionally putting this one off because I thought it was a little weird to read something that I wrote, but I've had enough people who have been asking about these characteristics and like random conversations related to this. And I keep pointing to this as like, hey, here's an example of something that might help you. So I hope this doesn't come across as like hubris or anything like that because I'm sharing something that I created. I just hope it in some way helps you out. And if it does, just please consider sharing it with somebody else, because maybe it'll help them too. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you stay tuned next week for another interview, and the following week for another Unpacking Scholarship episode. Hope you're all staying safe, and I hope you're all having a wonderful week.